Most men figure the worst phone call of their life is going to come from a doctor. Mine came from a locksmith standing inside my own garage, and by the time I hung up that phone, I already understood something was terribly wrong. The man I had been for 31 years of marriage was about to become somebody else entirely, and I had no idea just how far my own wife had gone to make that happen. My name is Franklin Doyle. I am 64 years old. I spent 36 years installing commercial refrigeration systems before I retired. And for the past 11 years I have spent every Wednesday evening coaching Little League at Whitmore Park in Springfield, Missouri. 9 days ago I believed I understood my life completely. I believed I had finally earned the quiet part, the stretch where nothing else was supposed to happen to a man like me. Before I get into what actually happened, if you are the kind of person who sticks around for a whole story, I would be grateful if you hit subscribe. It does not cost you anything, and it means something to an old man sitting alone in front of a microphone at midnight. Leave a comment too and tell me what you would have done in my position, because even now I am not entirely sure I did the right thing. My wife's name is Eleanor Doyle. We were married 31 years, together 34. She teaches a watercolor class at the community center on Tuesday afternoons. She reads 2 mystery novels a week, takes her tea black with a slice of lemon and never any sugar, and alphabetizes the spice rack without anyone asking her to. She cries during dog food commercials every single time without fail. I knew this woman. I would have sworn to it in front of a courtroom and a Bible without a moment of hesitation. Or at least I believed I did, right up until the Thursday that changed everything. It started on a hot Oklahoma-style afternoon in September, the kind of Missouri day where the heat has not yet gotten the memo that summer is supposed to be finished. Eleanor had flown out to Sacramento 4 days earlier to help her sister pack up a house after a difficult divorce. I was home alone that evening eating leftover meatloaf standing at the kitchen counter like a man with no one watching over him, which I suppose I was. That is when I noticed the garage door would not open. Not stuck, not jammed, simply dead. The keypad lit up fine, the remote clicked normally, but nothing moved, as though the entire mechanism had quietly decided to stop existing. I have repaired enough compressors and motors over the decades to know the difference between a part that is broken and a system that has been deliberately disconnected, and something about this felt like the second one. I called the company that had installed our garage door 8 years earlier, and within the hour a young technician named Dylan showed up, toolbox in one hand, energy drink in the other, the kind of young man who calls you sir out of pure habit, rather than respect. He told me to give him 15 minutes and disappeared into the garage. I went back to my meatloaf and gave him exactly that. Then my phone buzzed with a text from Dylan, who was standing barely 30 feet away from me on the other side of a wall. He wrote that there was a hatch cut into the garage ceiling behind the storage racks, sealed shut with a padlock from underneath, and he wanted to know if I knew anything about it. I actually laughed out loud, alone in my own kitchen, like a man who had finally lost the thread completely. I typed back that we did not have any hatch up there, that it was just crawl space insulation. 3 dots appeared on the screen, and then his next message landed like a stone dropping into still water. He said he was looking straight at it, and there was fresh sawdust scattered on the floor beneath it, and that this had not been cut 8 years ago. This was new. Fresh sawdust. I stood in my kitchen holding that phone and felt something in my chest go very still, the particular stillness a room takes on right before a storm rolls through. I walked into the garage and found Dylan standing on a stepladder with a flashlight, staring up at a square cut cleanly into the drywall ceiling, hidden behind the exact shelving unit Eleanor had insisted stay bolted to the wall 2 summers earlier, back when I had wanted to replace it with something sturdier. A padlock sealed from below meant somebody wanted that hatch closed from our side, not the other way around. I climbed up beside him, and that is when I heard it. Not breathing. Something almost worse. A slow, deliberate scratching, rhythmic as fingernails dragging across insulation over and over, patient as a clock ticking through the night. Dylan said we needed to call somebody and was already climbing back down the ladder before he finished the sentence. I called emergency services before I had even fully processed what I was saying into the phone. 2 Springfield police officers arrived inside of 10 minutes, and I stood in the garage of the house I had lived in for 22 years feeling like a stranger had rearranged my own furniture while I was asleep. They pried the hatch open with a crowbar, and I braced myself for something out of a nightmare. Instead, there was nothing living at all. A crawl space maybe 4 feet high, insulation pulled back in one corner, and sitting exactly in that corner, a small battery-powered speaker, still warm to the touch, propped beside a prepaid flip phone with a spider-webbed crack running across the screen, resting against a roll of duct tape, as if somebody had deliberately staged the whole scene. The scratching had been a recording, timed and remotely triggered, and one of the officers, a younger man named Reyes, turned the flip phone over carefully in gloved hands and told me the batteries were still warm, meaning someone had activated it recently, possibly within the hour. I told him Dylan had been standing right there the entire time, and he simply said that certainly looked to be the case. I need you to sit in that moment with me, because that is exactly where the ground first tilted underneath me. Even though I had not moved an inch, somebody had known precisely when a repairman would be standing on that ladder, waited for that exact instant, and pressed a button designed to send a 24-year-old technician into a panic text, which would send me into a panic call, which would put 2 officers crouched inside my crawl space on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. This was not random. This was a performance, and somebody had finished writing the entire script long before I ever picked up my phone. 2 days later, they found the storage unit. I could not tell you the exact hour it happened, the hour I stopped being a confused homeowner and quietly became a person police officers looked at differently, but it happened the way these things always seem to happen, softly, politely, without anybody ever announcing it out loud. One afternoon, a detective named Nora Kessler sat across from me at my own kitchen table with her notepad open, asking whether I had ever rented a storage unit off Kearney Street. I told her no without a second of hesitation. According to the paperwork sitting in front of her, I had rented one 3 separate times, paid entirely in cash, my signature present on every single agreement. When officers opened that unit, they found a suitcase belonging to a woman, a prepaid debit card tied to an account carrying my name, and a photograph. A woman around 40, sandy hair, laughing at whoever was holding the camera, with absolutely no idea her photograph would one day sit inside a police evidence bag. Detective Kessler studied my face the way a card player studies a hand they do not trust, and told me the woman in that photograph, a woman named Sandra Wells, had been reported missing for 9 days, and asked if I knew her. I told her no, that I had never once seen this woman in my life, and every word of that was completely true. But here is the part one did not tell Detective Kessler that afternoon. The part that split something open inside my chest that I needed to sit with alone before I could ever say it out loud. When I got home that evening, I walked straight upstairs to Eleanor's side of the closet, to the shoebox she kept on the top shelf full of old photographs she always claimed she meant to organize someday. I pulled it down and went through every single envelope inside, and there, tucked behind a stack of our own wedding pictures, was Sandra Wells, smiling in a photograph clearly printed at some drugstore kiosk, hidden in plain sight in the bedroom I had shared with my wife for over 3 decades. I sat down on the edge of our bed, in a house that suddenly felt like it belonged to a stranger, holding proof that my own wife had been keeping a missing woman's photograph in a shoebox directly above the pillow where we slept every single night. I thought back through all 34 years, every anniversary dinner, every quiet Sunday morning where she read her mystery novels with black tea and lemon while I worked the crossword across the table from her, completely at ease. How long had Sandra Wells been sitting in that shoebox? How long had Eleanor been quietly building whatever this was? At 64, I had always assumed the worst thing that could happen to a man my age was his knees finally giving out or his heart doing something it should not. It turns out the actual worst thing is discovering that the woman who fell asleep beside you for 3 decades was never the person you believed you had married at all. If you are still with me, and you want more stories like this one, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because it genuinely helps an old man out more than you know. Now here is something nobody ever warns you about when your own spouse sets you up. The evidence is never the hardest part to absorb. The hardest part is realizing she was never distracted, never stressed, never quietly working through some phase you simply did not understand. She was working the entire time, patiently, methodically, and you were nothing more than the raw material she was shaping. It had been 5 days since Dylan first texted me about that hatch. 5 days since 2 officers crouched inside my crawl space looking at me like a man who needed to be watched carefully. 5 days since Detective Kessler had begun appearing, not always with a reason, sometimes simply parked across the street in an unmarked sedan, as if I would not notice a stranger's car sitting near my mailbox for 2 straight hours. I noticed. I am 64, not senile. Eleanor flew home from Sacramento the day after the garage incident. I had not told her everything over the phone, only that something strange had happened, and she needed to come back immediately. When she walked through our front door, she looked exactly the way a frightened wife is supposed to look. Wide eyes, both hands pressed to my face, her voice trembling as she asked what had happened and whether I was all right. And for almost a full hour, Lord help me, I believed every single word of it. She cried when I showed her the crawl space, real tears or close enough that I could not tell the difference, and honestly I am still not certain there is one. She held on to my arm the entire time as I explained the hatch, the speaker, the flip phone. She said everything a shocked wife is supposed to say, that this was terrifying, that we needed to figure out who would do such a thing to us, that maybe we should call a lawyer. That last question I originally took for fear talking. I understand now that it was planning. The storage unit cracked her performance, but only for the space of a heartbeat. When Detective Kessler returned 4 days later and told us both about Unit 212, I was watching Eleanor's face the entire time. Most people would have missed what happened next. It lasted less than a second, a tiny freeze, like a video buffering right before it catches back up to itself. Then the tears returned exactly on schedule. She said somebody was clearly framing her husband, that this was obviously a setup, that I had never rented a storage unit in my entire life. Detective Kessler looked at her, then at me, then back at her, and asked how she could possibly know that with such certainty. Eleanor did not hesitate for even a fraction of a second. She said it was because she knew her husband. I replayed that single sentence probably 300 times over the following 2 days. She did not say I would never do something like that. She did not say it was impossible. She said she knew me, which quietly reframed the entire conversation around certainty rather than character. It was a lawyer's answer wearing a wife's voice, and once I heard it that way I could not unhear it. Here is where things start to become more deliberate, so stay with me. I have an old Army friend named Gordon Pierce. He spent 22 years working fraud investigation for a major insurance company before retiring, which means he spent his entire professional life learning exactly how people construct lies capable of holding their shape under pressure. I called Gordon on day 6 and laid out everything. He was quiet on the phone for a long stretch before finally asking how many joint accounts Eleanor and I shared. I told him 2, checking and savings. He asked who handled them, and I opened my mouth to answer before simply stopping. Eleanor had handled them since our 5th year of marriage, back when I told her the paperwork bored me half to death, and she offered to take it over. I had not given it a second thought since. Why would I? Bills got paid, savings quietly grew, everything looked perfectly fine on the surface. Gordon told me to pull every statement I could find, going back at least 6 years. I pulled 8. What I found did not jump off the page at me, and that was exactly the cleverness of it. No dramatic withdrawals, no wire transfers to some island bank account. Instead, small, patient, almost invisible movements. $80 here, routed to an account I did not recognize. A recurring charge tied to a business name I had never once heard of. A cash withdrawal every couple of months, never quite large enough to trigger a bank's attention. Over 8 years, it added up to a little more than $54,000, moved so carefully that I never noticed a single ripple across the surface. I sat at my kitchen table at 1 in the morning staring at those numbers, and I felt a very specific kind of cold settle into my chest. Not fear exactly, something closer to scale. Because this was not a decision Eleanor made after a rough year or a difficult season in our marriage. The very first strange transaction was dated 16 months after our wedding day. She had started this while we were still hanging curtains in our first house together. Gordon drove over the next morning, and we spread everything across my dining room table. The bank records, the storage unit paperwork, the police report, a timeline I had sketched out on a legal pad somewhere around 2 in the morning. He studied it all quietly, which for Gordon is roughly the equivalent of another man breaking down in tears. When he finally spoke, he asked me to walk him through my phone the week The storage unit had been rented. I asked what he meant, and he asked where my phone had been the night before that rental agreement was signed. I thought about it. Nightstand, I said. I charge it there every single night. And Eleanor, he asked. Same room, obviously, I said. We share a bedroom. I had shared that bedroom with her for 31 years, and never once considered my own charging phone a weak point in anything. She had taken it while I slept, driven across town, signed the rental agreement in my name, using my own signature the way you might hum a song you had heard 10,000 times before, paid in cash, set up the whole arrangement, and been back under the covers before my alarm ever went off. Gordon asked next about the garage door, whether I had called from my cell phone since we did not have a landline anymore, and told me to pull my outgoing call log for that specific day. I already knew somewhere underneath what I was going to find before I actually found it. The call to the garage door company had gone out from my number at 9:14 in the morning. I had already been standing in the hardware store by 8:30, and I had a receipt with a timestamp to prove exactly where I was. Eleanor had made that call from my phone, taken again or perhaps never fully returned, and scheduled a repairman she already knew would end up staring straight at a freshly cut hatch, hearing a recorded scratching sound, and texting me directly into a panic. She had built the entire opening act herself, brick by careful brick. Gordon told me this was not something a person throws together in a few months. Financial movement stretching back 8 years, my name on accounts I had never opened, my signature on a lease I had never signed. That takes practice, he said, repetition. Then he paused and told me something I have not been able to shake since. She did not just study you, he said. She became fluent in you. I stood up and walked over to the kitchen window, looking out at the backyard, at the flower beds Eleanor had planted 3 summers earlier, the ones I had watered faithfully every single evening, because she told me the roots needed consistency. I had been watering her garden while she quietly built my coffin somewhere beneath it. At 64 years old, I had exactly 1 move left, and I had not told Gordon about it yet, because it only worked if Eleanor believed, fully and completely, that her plan had already succeeded. She needed to think she had already won. I needed her comfortable for just a little while longer. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a man once he stops being afraid and starts becoming deliberate instead. I found that quiet on a Sunday morning, sitting at my table in front of cold coffee and 8 years of bank statements, and I made a decision I have not lost a single hour of sleep over since. I did not call a lawyer. I did not confront Eleanor. I did not march everything Gordon and I had assembled directly into Detective Kessler's office, because evidence only carries real weight when the man presenting it still has credibility left, and as far as the Springfield police were concerned, I was a 64-year-old man whose signature was sitting on a storage unit that held a missing woman's belongings. Eleanor had accounted for that too. Of course she had. So I did the one thing she had never planned for. I became a man she could no longer read. First, I called my younger brother, Russell Doyle, retired Army National Guard, living out toward the edge of town, the kind of man who owns several rifles legally, speaks almost entirely in short sentences, and has not panicked about anything since sometime around 1987. I drove out to see him on a Tuesday, telling Eleanor I needed a few days to clear my head, and watched her face rearrange itself perfectly into the expression of a patient, understanding wife. "Take whatever time you need, honey," she said, and I very nearly smiled right there on the spot. At Russell's kitchen table over black coffee and his wife's leftover cornbread, I laid out everything for him: the hatch, the storage unit, the bank statements, the phone records, the photograph tucked behind our wedding pictures. He listened without a single interruption, which from Russell is roughly equivalent to another man weeping openly. When I finally finished, he sat quiet for a long moment, then asked whether Eleanor had someone she talked to, somebody close. I told him about her friend Carol Whitfield, a woman she had known since long before Eleanor and I ever met, who called constantly, sometimes twice a week, and visited from Kansas City 3 or 4 times a year, during which the two of them would take long walks around the block or sit on the back porch with the door shut. Russell nodded slowly and asked how long I had owned a baby monitor sitting out on that back porch. I told him I had never owned one. "I know," he said, completely straight-faced, "but you are about to." I want to be honest with you here, friend. I am not a vengeful man by nature. I coached Little League for 11 straight years. I have never thrown a punch outside of a boxing gym in my entire life. I am the guy at every family reunion who makes sure everybody has a drink in their hand and remembers who is allergic to shellfish. Revenge was never part of my original makeup. But I have always been a patient man. And it turns out patience is the only currency that actually matters, once you find yourself playing a long game. Russell ordered a small audio monitor online, paid cash at a shipping store, and had it sent to a post office box, the kind of operational habit that decades in the Guard apparently wires permanently into a man. I drove home Thursday and told Eleanor I was feeling steadier, letting her hug me in the doorway while I silently counted her heartbeat against my chest and felt absolutely nothing. That was the strangest part of all of it. Not anger, not grief, just a clean, cold clarity settling into place. I planted the monitor on a Saturday afternoon while Eleanor was out getting her hair done, tucking it behind a ceramic planter on the back porch that neither of us had moved in 15 years. It took me maybe 5 minutes. I drove out to Russell's that evening, confirmed the audio was coming through clean on his laptop, and made it home in plenty of time for supper. Eleanor made pot roast that night and asked if I was finally starting to feel like myself again. Getting there, I told her, and she smiled and topped off my iced tea without a hint of suspicion. I waited 17 days. 17 days of being Franklin Doyle, devoted husband, cooperative person of interest, casual subject of an ongoing missing persons case. 17 days answering Detective Kessler's questions patiently, letting Eleanor squeeze my hand in front of her, watching my wife perform worry so convincingly that even I had moments, brief and disorienting moments, where I wondered whether grief had simply made me imagine this entire thing. Then on a Wednesday evening in the 3rd week, Carol Whitfield came down for a visit. I made myself scarce, told Eleanor I was heading over to Gordon's for the evening, kissed her cheek, and drove exactly 6 blocks before pulling over and opening my phone. The audio came through clear as a bell. They talked for nearly half an hour about nothing much at all: Carol's job, a nephew's graduation, a barbecue place in Kansas City worth the drive. I nearly convinced myself I had wired a listening device onto my own porch purely out of paranoia, letting Gordon's fraud investigator instincts talk me into something ridiculous. Then Eleanor's voice shifted, subtle, like somebody changing key on a piano. The same instrument, the same hands, but an entirely different song underneath it. She got quieter, more exact. All the warmth drained slowly and completely out of her voice, like water leaving a bathtub. "He has not got the faintest idea," Eleanor said. Carol went quiet for a moment before asking if she was sure. "He is out there mowing the lawn, coaching those kids on Wednesdays. And the detective has him half convinced he is a suspect," Eleanor said. "Frank is just Frank. He is exactly who he has always been. He does not see past what is directly in front of him. He never has." Then Carol asked about the woman, whether Sandra was safe. Eleanor said she had agreed to stay gone for 60 days, that she was out in Las Vegas, and that Eleanor had paid her enough that she would not say a single word. By the time the 60 days were up, Eleanor said, Frank would be too buried under all of it to even matter anymore. There was a pause, and Carol's voice went careful, almost hesitant, asking what actually happens to him. Eleanor answered without a flicker of hesitation. "He becomes the answer to a question the police are already asking," she said, simple as reading a grocery list. "They already have his signature, his name, his money trail. All I have to do now is let it finish building on its own. Give it a few more weeks, and it will not even need me involved anymore. It will simply carry its own weight." Carol asked where Eleanor would be by then, and Eleanor said somewhere with an ocean, and then she laughed, easy and warm and completely unguarded, the laugh of a woman watching a plan click perfectly into place after years of patient work. I sat in my truck 6 blocks from my own house, listening to my wife laugh about the architecture of my ruin, and that same cold settled back over me, still and complete. I did not call Russell. I did not call Gordon. I did not call Gordon. I did not call Detective Kessler. Not yet. I want to tell you about Sandra Wells, friend, because she matters in all of this too. 2 days after Carol's visit, I hired a retired Springfield detective named Vincent Salazar, a friend of Gordon's, the kind of man whose entire personality is a filing cabinet with legs. I gave Vincent one job, find Sandra Wells. It took him 5 days. She was in Las Vegas exactly as Eleanor had said, staying at a mid-tier hotel off the Strip, paying in cash, checked in under a name that was not quite her own. Vincent got photographs, got her on record, and got a notarized statement from a woman who, it turned out, had not fully understood the legal weight of what she had agreed to, and who became considerably less relaxed about the whole arrangement once a retired detective sat across from her in a hotel lobby and explained exactly what the word accessory meant in a court of law. Sandra Wells was not a criminal friend. She was a woman who needed money badly enough to make a catastrophic decision. She told Vincent everything, how Eleanor had found her, what she had been promised, how she had been carefully coached on staying gone for exactly 60 days. She signed the statement with a trembling hand and cried for a good 10 minutes afterward, and Vincent sat with her through the whole thing, because underneath that filing cabinet exterior, the man is decent to his core. I now had a recorded conversation from my own back porch and a signed statement from a missing woman who had never actually been missing at all. 2 things Eleanor had absolutely no idea existed. Here is what I did not do next. I did not march straight into Springfield PD and hand everything over at once, because evidence delivered by a suspect, however clean, gets swallowed into a long, grinding legal process, and during that process Eleanor would lawyer up, go silent, and spend the next year and a half dismantling everything I had carefully built from the other side of a courtroom. She was very good at dismantling things. I understood that now better than anyone alive. So I did something quieter instead. On a Sunday evening, while Eleanor sat out on that same back porch with a mystery novel and her black tea, I sat at the kitchen table and sent 2 files from an email address she had never seen to a number she would not recognize, an audio clip, and a photograph. Sandra Wells, alive and smiling in Las Vegas, holding up that morning's newspaper. No message attached, no explanation offered. I closed the laptop, rinsed my mug, and went upstairs to bed. Eleanor came up roughly half an hour later. I watched through barely opened eyes as she stood frozen in the bedroom doorway. Phone lit up in her hand, completely and utterly still. In 31 years I had never once seen Eleanor Doyle stand that still. She was always moving, adjusting, managing something in the background. She stood in that doorway like a woman who had just heard a sound she could not place. Good, I thought. The next morning I drove down to Detective Kessler's office and set Vincent's full report on her desk. The statement, the photographs, the bank records, the call logs, all of it organized neatly inside a manila folder, because I have always been a thorough man. She read through it for nearly 10 minutes without once lifting her eyes. When she finally looked up, she called me Mr. Doyle, and I told her to just call me Franklin, that I believed we both already understood I had never rented that storage unit. She studied me a long moment, then reached slowly for her phone. Eleanor was arrested on a Thursday morning, 11 charges in total, including conspiracy and obstruction. She was walked out of our house in handcuffs right around 9 o'clock, cold enough that morning that you could see your own breath hanging in the air. I watched the whole thing unfold from the front porch. She turned and looked back at me once, only once, as the officers guided her toward the patrol car, and for the very first time in 34 years I could not read a single thing behind her eyes. I could not find the calculation, could not locate the woman who had studied me like a forger studies somebody else's handwriting. She simply looked at me, and I nodded. Because here is the one thing Eleanor never fully understood about me, the single miscalculation sitting right at the center of her entire careful plan. She had spent years studying what I did, where I went, how I signed my name, how I slept at night beside her. She never once bothered studying what I was actually thinking underneath it all. At 64, I am not a dramatic man. I do not make speeches. I do not slam doors on my way out of a room. I do not need to have the last word in any argument. I only needed the last move. She spent 15 years, maybe longer, quietly building a cage around me, one careful transaction at a time. I built her one in 17 days flat. Somewhere out there tonight, Eleanor Doyle is looking over her shoulder for a ghost she made entirely by herself, a husband she was absolutely certain she had already won, a man she underestimated right up until the exact moment it mattered most. She knew my signature better than I did. She never once knew my spine, and that, friend, was always going to be her only real mistake. If this story meant something to you tonight, Do an old man a kindness and hit that subscribe button, drop a like on your way out, and tell me down in the comments what you would have done in my shoes. Real trust is never built on never asking questions. It is built on paying attention, day after day, quietly, until the pieces either fit together or they do not. I did not win because I was angry. I won because I stayed calm, stayed patient, and quietly noticed what no longer added up. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is trust your own gut, keep your composure under pressure, and remember that clarity will always beat panic in the end. Thank you for sitting with me through this one, friend. I will see you next time.